The image you are currently viewing depicts one of the most savage crimes of the Second World War. In it, we can see a mountain of completely destroyed corpses after a bombing. You might think that this massacre was committed by the Nazis. However, that's not the case. The culprits of this carnage were the planes of the United States. Today, in this new episode of Military History, we will tell you everything about the worst war crimes committed by the Americans. Number 4. Operation Teardrop. Let's begin with one of the lesser-known crimes of the United States. In 1944, the American intelligence service was convinced that Hitler had prepared a fleet of submarines loaded with missiles. It was supposed to be used to bomb the city of New York, completely destroying it and wiping out the population. As expected, the US government planned a military maneuver to defend against the threat before it was too late. Thus, Operation Teardrop was born, a campaign by the American Navy to hunt down German submarines lurking in the waters of the North Atlantic. The operation proceeded normally, with Uncle Sam's ships patrolling the waters accompanied by planes. Here are some images that attest to this.
Flying high above a United Nations convoy somewhere in the Atlantic, Navy cameramen accompany patrol planes on the lookout for enemy submarines.
Everything changed on April 24, 1945, when a fierce encounter occurred that would end in tragedy. On that day, a German submarine was detected by the U.S. destroyer USS Frederick C. Davis. Realizing that it had been discovered, the officer in command of the U-boat, Lieutenant Captain Paul Just, ordered the ship to be torpedoed. The projectile pierced it to the engine room, causing irreparable damage and sinking it 5 minutes later. Out of a total of 192 crew members, 126 died. Over the next 10 hours, other American ships set out for revenge and pursued the submarine across the ocean until they managed to corner and destroy it. Before the U-boat was lost in the depths of the Atlantic, they captured 32 Germans, including Lieutenant Captain Just. It was at this moment that the Americans ignored all rules of war and, instead of treating the prisoners decently, subjected them to brutal interrogations. The goal was to extract information about Hitler's plans to bomb New York. They likely also wanted to vent their anger over the 192 Marines who had died on the USS Frederick C. Davis. In any case, the Germans were tortured in extremely cruel ways, receiving savage beatings, forced to perform strenuous physical exercises for hours. They were deprived of food and forbidden to sleep until they confessed their plans. After some sessions of torment, Lieutenant Captain Just agreed to provide confidential information about his submarine's plans. Finally, the detainees were sent to a prisoner of war camp in Fort Hunt, Virginia, where they remained until the end of the war. The methods of the Americans were never judged as crimes and remain unpunished to this day. Number 3. Mutilations in the Pacific. The photo you are currently looking at was published on May 22, 1944 by Life, a highly popular American leisure magazine. The accompanying text to the image reads as follows. When Natalie Nickerson's fiancé said goodbye 2 years ago, he promised to bring her back a Japanese. He was a Navy lieutenant from Arizona, tall and handsome. Last week, Natalie received a human skull bearing the signature of her future husband. It read as follows. This is a good Jap, one we recently picked up on the beach in New Guinea. Surprised by the gift, she named the skull Tojo. However, the armed forces disagree with such actions. Believe it or not, the practice of mutilating the corpse of a Japanese and keeping a part of their body was widespread among Americans. This was because, in the Pacific theater of war, Americans were convinced that they were fighting against inferior beings who did not deserve compassion. The origin of such hatred traced back to the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, when Japanese planes ravaged an American military base. The toll was 2,400 civilians and military personnel dead, as well as almost 200 destroyed aircraft. The offensive was seen by the U.S. population as an act as cowardly as savage, worthy of bloodthirsty barbarians. The press referred to the Japanese using insults such as parasites, yellow scum, and rats. The stage was set for Uncle Sam's soldiers to massacre the Empire's troops once they faced them. Next, you can see them in action, using all their weaponry to exterminate them. When a battle ended, Americans rushed to search among the bodies strewn on the ground. When they found one that was more or less intact, they took out a knife, pressed it against the flesh, and cut off a piece. Trophies could be ears, noses, hands, or teeth. However, the most coveted prize was nothing more and nothing less than the head, although beheading a man was no easy task. The procedure was as dirty as it was tedious, and a person not prepared for it could end up vomiting everything they had eaten a few hours ago. Tendons and muscles had to be cut, and once the head was freed from the rest of the body, it was necessary to deflesh it until only the skull remained. Although Americans saw it as a light-hearted gesture, for Army officers, it was an unpleasant and extremely cruel practice. In 1944, high-ranking officials were forced to issue an order prohibiting mutilations, although it was disobeyed. Gutting and amputations continued to be commonplace until the end of the war. Number 2. The Biscari Massacre. In mid-1943, as fascism was beginning to be defeated, the Allies launched the conquest of Italy. Italy was the weakest link in the Axis. As its army was poorly equipped and even worse trained, nothing compared to the might of Nazi Germany. The invasion of Italy would start with Sicily, and the plan was to open a new front in southern Europe that would check the Third Reich. In this operation, the Allies encountered almost no resistance. People surrendered as soon as they saw the invaders. Battles were few, and indeed, Italians seemed happy that the war was coming to an end. Let's take a look at a British newsreel from that time reporting on the invasion.
Tons of supplies and equipment are ferried ashore. At many points, troops waded in, surprised to find much less resistance than expected.
However, none of this would prevent the Americans from committing a brutal massacre. This was because a significant portion of the troops was convinced that their duty was to exterminate every Italian they came across. They had good reasons to think so, as when they were traveling by boat to Sicily, they heard a speech on the loudspeakers by General George Patton, the man in charge of the operation. The incendiary words went as follows. "Throughout the battle, you may see enemies shooting at you, but when they are surrounded, they will try to surrender. Those bastards must die. Kill them, stab them in the side or liver. We will earn a reputation as killers, so that when rumors spread that we are savages, no one will want to face us." Although Patton did not suspect it, this speech had a huge psychological impact on his men. Now the soldiers felt empowered to do whatever they wanted without facing the consequences. The moment of truth came on July 14, 1943, when a battle took place in Biscari, a small town in Sicily. The Americans emerged victorious and captured 48 enemies. The prisoners were in the custody of Sergeant Horace West, who would soon prove to be an unstable and sadistic person. The officer led the prisoners to the rear, where the rest of the army could not see them until they reached an almost deserted olive grove. West couldn't shake the image of his comrades killed in the Biscari battle. And now he planned to take revenge, by unleashing his fury on the detainees. He took a Thompson submachine gun and told his assistant, "Turn around if you don't want to see." Then, he aimed at the prisoners and opened fire on them, riddling them with a burst of bullets. The victims fell to the ground, bleeding from their wounds and uttering cries of agony. For the sergeant, this was not enough. He wanted to make sure his enemies were definitively dead. For this reason, he approached them with a pistol and, one by one, finished them off with a shot to the heart. Now, West had satisfied his thirst for revenge, and the massacre had been successfully completed. Once news of the Biscari massacre spread throughout the army, it quickly reached Patton's ears. The murderer argued that he had been driven to kill by the general's speech. However, Patton was surprised by this claim and maintained that he had never intended to push his men into committing such a slaughter. West was tried by a military court, found guilty, and sentenced to life in prison. Nevertheless, the sergeant would be pardoned by President Dwight Eisenhower, who cleared him of his guilt and allowed him to continue serving in the army until he passed away in 1974. Thus, the killer escaped justice and never received a sentence commensurate with his crimes. Number 1. The bombing of Dresden. On February 13, 1945, the citizens of the German city of Dresden faced the apocalypse. By then, the Third Reich was cornered by the Soviets, and it was clear that it had no chance of winning the war. However, no one suspected that Dresden could be the target of a massive attack. There were no important targets in the city, no weapon factories or military barracks with large troop concentrations. There were only expectant civilians, eager for the war to end, so that everything could return to normal. None of them were aware that in a matter of minutes they would be reduced to ashes. The bombing was a joint operation of the American and British Air Forces. The Luftwaffe had no pilots or planes, so there was no way to stop the Allied aircraft. The German radar system was severely weakened, and they didn't even have anti-aircraft artillery to defend themselves. In other words, the city was an easy prey, ready to be devoured by the first one to propose it. Between February 13 and 15, more than 2,000 planes unleashed a firestorm over Dresden. In total, almost 4,000 tons of explosives and incendiary bombs were used. The city center was shattered, and about 25,000 people, mostly civilians not involved in the war, lost their lives. Let's listen to the testimony of Lothar Metzger, a survivor of the massacre. "We saw terrible things. Adults charred to the size of a small child, pieces of arms, legs, corpses everywhere, whole families burned. People on fire ran through the streets, cars engulfed in flames with people inside. The population called out for their children and families. There was a burning wind that pushed the victims back into the burning houses they were trying to escape from. I can't forget these terrible details. I never can." But the attack not only affected native Germans, it also claimed the lives of prisoners of war who were locked in the city. Let's hear the testimony of Victor Gregg, an Englishman who had been captured and was now in the eye of the storm with his friend Harry.
This bomb landed outside the building, big bomb it was, must have been, and smashed the building completely. And it picked me up, threw me over the other side of the building, and I got covered in all the dust and the stuff. And Harry must have taken a full concussion, because when I finally come to and crawled back to where he was dead. Harry there wasn't a mark on him, except all the blood and stuff had come out every orifice he had. So that's what I assumed, that
what had happened?
Concussion had killed him.
Every testimony about the bombing is more tragic than the other. Let's hear the words of Margaret Fryer, another survivor. "To my left, I saw another woman. To this day, I can see it. and it will never be erased from my memory. She was carrying a bundle in her arms, her baby. She was running, but suddenly she stumbled, and the child flew towards a pile of fire. A manic fear seized me, and from then on, I repeated a simple prayer to myself. I don't want to burn to death. I don't know how I managed to get out of there. Today, historians agree that the bombing was an unnecessary maneuver, serving only to terrorize the German population and show them what could happen if they did not surrender soon. We've reached the end of the video, and we want to ask you, which Allied country committed the worst war crimes? Leave your answer in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for many more military events that left their mark on history.